Malcolm Brogdon to the Celtics. One of the bigger moves this offseason so far. I think a move that could have a big impact on the Celtics, but we're all left kind of saying this price, this return doesn't seem to add up when we were looking at this trade in the past and kind of kicking this one around. Caitlin, great to have you back. Hope you're doing well. Hope the summer's going great. What was your initial reaction to seeing Brogdon finally traded for Tice, Neesmith, a pick, and basically some filler contracts here?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me back on. Yeah, I think I was a little bit surprised. I mean, everyone in Indiana, I think, pretty much knew that at the very least, Malcolm Brogdon was not going to finish next season on the Indiana Pacers. I was going to be surprised if he even started next season on the Indiana Pacers, given what the little sample size was with Tyrese Halliburton and what the language had been around acquiring Tyrese Halliburton. They referred to him after that trade was done as their franchise point guard. They've compared him to a Boston reference, Tom Brady. They've compared him to Andrew Luck,
Really?
and oh yes, yes, that's how they see him moving forward. So it seemed like the writing was on the wall a little bit. Now they did temper that once Brogdon was back and was healthy enough to play for those little sample size, where Rick Carlisle essentially said like, well, now we're going to have 2 point guards on the floor. But you could very much know, like I think Rick Carlisle typically says things with a purpose. And when Malcolm Brogdon left the Milwaukee Bucks and signed with the Indiana Pacers, in restricted free agency, he was asked and said, my ideal position is point guard. And I think that mattered to him a lot when he came over, that he wanted to be able to show people that he could play point guard. So it felt a little bit telling when Rick Carlisle was like, well, now we can have 2 point guards on the floor. So I'm interested to see how that's going to play out with the Celtics. Just in terms of the return, I think that probably got diluted a bit when you look at what Malcolm's injury history has been. He hasn't played 60 games in 3 seasons. So I'm sure that was probably a factor for Brad Stevens. And, you never know exactly what the executives value. For the Pacers' perspective, that pick isn't going to be great. It's going to be probably close to the second round because the Pacers just gave the Celtics a player who's going to hopefully help them be better even than they were last year when they went to the NBA Finals, or at least equal to. So, but they do already have a pick potentially coming from the Cavaliers. If the Cavs make the playoffs, and they'll have their own pick. So if you have 3 firsts, there's potential that you have a lot of flexibility there. Maybe you can move up, maybe you can do something. Maybe they really like Aaron Neesmith, and now there's a lot of rumors coming out that they might be throwing a max offer sheet at DeAndre Ayton. So doing that trade in the way that they did gave them that max slot. It gave them cap space. So maybe they really valued that in order to go after, potentially their franchise center as well.
Yeah, the pick here, the big one for sure. It probably won't be a great pick, but it's something. And who knows what kind of pick compensation was out there otherwise for Brogdon. They did make the weird move. Last time we talked, we were kicking around maybe Brogdon being a fit on the Celtics or some other Pacers and Smart going back and forth. We were trying to find the perfect trade here. And it did seem like Brogdon made sense for Boston before, but Indiana signed him to that extension that I think now takes him through 2025, made him trade ineligible at the time through the end of the season. And it sort of put them in a tough spot. I wonder what the thinking was behind that extension because it took away all their trade flexibility throughout the season. And I know when they signed it, they didn't have Halliburton at that point, but it's just been a weird tenure as a whole from Brogdon there. Like it looked like he was going to be a centerpiece for Indiana in the early end of the contract when they were a pretty good playoff caliber team at that point. And then by the end of it, he sort of gets displaced there, but has that extension anyway that's sitting there. It's just such a weird tenure in the end, looking back on it for Brogdon there. Injuries, role, bounced around, multiple coaches. Just how do you look back at his tenure there?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at that extension, I think we talked about that a little bit on our podcast as well, wondering like if that extension hadn't have happened, what would his trade value have been like at the end of the season versus having it? Because a lot of times we look at players in expiring situations and we think, that's going to let a team lowball them because they're not going to have as much leverage. But in the case of Brogdon, when an opponent has to take on, extra risk in case, you don't know what his injury and his health status is going to be. I do wonder if that diluted his value a little bit. When they went into, quote unquote rumor season, there was stuff put out there that maybe the Pacers could get number 10 or 11 from the Knicks or the Wizards. And then that shortly turned into, oh, that was never a possibility. And then also like, well, Brogdon's actually a negative trade asset. Like Indiana might have to send something out. So this was kind of the happy middle when you consider those two kind of polar opposite outcomes. But yeah, I mean, Brogdon, when he first came over, like you said, I mean, I feel like I've covered probably 10 different Pacer teams in the last 3 years because
Yep.
when he originally signed, Victor Oladipo, was thought that maybe he would come back and look somewhat like Victor Oladipo, and that's how the point guard conversation kind of originated. How are the two of them going to fit on the court? And he essentially said, my ideal position is point guard, but he can have the ball as much as he wants, and he knows that I'm going to get the ball to him in his spots. And then as it turned out, they didn't actually play that much together. And when they did play together in the bubble, Victor wasn't himself anymore. He was a very different version of himself. So then the Bjorkgren season happens, and in my opinion, Brogdon was way overtaxed that season. He and Sabonis were playing major minutes very early, as if Game 7 of the regular season was Game 7 of a playoff series. And his workload in terms of his touches, his time of possession was very heavy. And I think the last 3 seasons, you can really see that by the end of the year, he had kind of worn down. Like if you look, I mean, all three before they went to the bubble, if there wouldn't have been the 4 month hiatus, he most likely would not have been able to play in the playoffs because he had a torn quad tendon that kind of goes over your hip. I don't remember the specific terminology for it. But then last year, going into the play-in tournament, he had a hamstring injury. He was able to play, but he missed several games there. And now this year, he obviously sat at the end. I think some of that was to improve the Pacers draft positioning, but, again, missed a lot of games and it wore on him as the season went on. So I think that's kind of a summary from the health standpoint. From a basketball standpoint, you could see different shifts between what some of the coaches were willing to do. I mean, I would say under Nate McMillan, I think most people know, is a lot more amenable to the mid range in general. So the pick and roll between Sabonis and Brogdon in that 1920 season, like that was almost a guaranteed bucket. Like when the two of them were in 2-man game, you felt like, you were wearing a warm blanket, like you felt safe when the two of them were out there. But by the next season, Nate Bjorkgren was not so much, and teams really figured out, because the Pacers led the league and movement on offense, that a good way to or to get rid of that movement was to go under. So a lot of teams were going under against Malcolm Brogdon and really testing his ability to hit pull up threes. And there wasn't as much room. It didn't seem to me like Bjorkgren was as amenable to letting Sabonis automatically rescreen that and let Brogdon get into the mid-range area where he's a little bit more comfortable and hit that pull-up too. So that was causing him to have to drive a lot. And I mean, he did have a career season under Nate Bjorkgren, but you could see the way that impacted their offense a bit. Now this year under Rick Carlisle, he once again was tasked, like his time of possession and stuff was pretty close to what Luka's was in Dallas. So the 3-point shooting did not rebound this year. I think some of that has to do with injuries, but I'm sure we'll get into more of that as we go on as well.
Yeah, the injuries is the big one, and that's, I think, why his costs, more than anything else, reached what it did here. At 40 of the last 50 games last year, you mentioned the tank implications there, probably extended that Achilles injury a little bit than it would have been if, they had something to play for there. Injuries just about every year of his career since his rookie year, so you can almost assume that he's going to miss 10, 20, maybe more games going into a year. Celtics, fortunately, I think well positioned as we kicked around off the air to, assume an injury, given that they have Marcus Smart, given that they have Derek White, other guys at that position. Like, it won't be devastating to see him step out of the lineup for, a moderate amount of time during the year, unless it's a big injury that completely changes the course of his or the team's season. So I think it makes sense to assume the risk in that sense. They could eat the tax here, which is great. I don't know if anyone was certain that the Celtics were going to go this deep into the tax, pushing, I think, a $40 million bill at this point, which is just unprecedented for them. But they did it for this player. And I found the biggest intriguing point that multiple writers, Woj breaking it, made is that this is the Celtics going after their true playmaking point guard. And, that phrase has been tossed around the Celtics, has been tossed around Marcus Smart, whether he is that guy or isn't that guy. I think it's impossible to argue against anyone who said they needed to go and improve that spot after a postseason where their turnover rate went up in every round, where they couldn't hold on to the ball at all through their last 3 losses of the NBA Finals there. But I think everybody's looking at Brogdon and wondering, is he that guy? Because this is a player who, in Milwaukee at his best, it was off the ball, secondary drives, catch and shoot. He had that amazing 50, 40, 90 season everybody points to, which feels like forever ago now. Some similar stuff in Indiana, though he tried to make that transition to the point guard spot, it seemed there. But it still feels like they have 2 guys in Smart and Brogdon who have played more of their career off the ball than on the ball, organizing things. They both have the skills that bode well to do that role in spots. But it doesn't feel like either of these guys are really the guy to have the ball all game and be running the offense.
Yeah, I mean, Brogdon's been their primary point guard for the Pacers for 3 years. I mean, I think a lot of people in Indiana think that that needed to shift. I would refer to him, or what I call him, as a 1.75. He can run offense, but I think he's better off playing off ball, being a slot driver, attacking closeouts, doing drive and kick in that type of way. I mean, I think that Boston will be able to use him in pick and roll. His pick and roll efficiency is very good, in part because his turnover rate is so very, very low. If you were to look that up on Synergy, I think there's like 17 players in the NBA who had a turnover frequency in the pick and roll below 10%, and he's one
He
of
had a
them.
great year even last year, it looked like, in that role. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, he's one of them. But the thing that I would describe is it's kind of like when you get glasses for the first time when Tyrese Halliburton came over, and it's like, oh, that's how the offense was supposed to look. So like Brogdon can read the defense and find the open man. He's not going to shift tertiary defenders for you. Like Tyrese is going to actually shift taggers, shift guys at the nail, and make people more open. I don't really think that's something Malcolm Brogdon does. He can hit pause. He has a nice change of speed, a hesitation at times. He can get into offense, but um, I've noticed over the last 2 years, because like I said, the first year, it was like he and Sabonis were money. The next year, teams started really going under, and that bothered him. This year, I mean, part of the reason the Pacers were struggling in clutch time a lot was they would get into fourth quarters and like one of three things would happen. Teams would either really start full court pressing them, like they were in New York, and Tom Thibodeau unleashed Alec Burks against Malcolm Brogdon, pressured him 94 feet, and Brogdon really doesn't have the burst handle combination to handle that and get into offense very well. Or they would start blitzing him. And in theory, you would think, well, that's going to be really beneficial because Sabonis is so good on the short roll. But like you could point to game after game after game where he would be getting blitzed, and they wouldn't. They had like a strange allergy to being able to get the ball to the middle of the floor. His
Yep.
pass accuracy could be a little bit better out to 3-point shooters, I think, at times. And like if he's going to throw a skip pass, sometimes that guy's going to have to, shift over and get out of his shooting pocket and then get back into it. I think that's a little bit of a thing as well. But the main thing that I think stands out as a weakness for Brogdon when he's running pick and roll, and if people want to go look at this, I would very much recommend that you watch the game that they played in Denver against Denver, because they used Austin Rivers to weak him. So I'm talking about a middle pick and roll. They're weaking Brogdon to his left, because if you watch Malcolm Brogdon enough in the pick and roll, if he goes right, he will generally shoot. If he goes left, he's almost exclusively going to drive. He's not
Hmm.
comfortable going left as a shooter. So teams will either weak him and force him to do that and have him drive into a crowd, or they'll go under. And then he's just not as good of a shooter off the dribble as he is in catch and shoot situations. So that stands out. And then also, just like if he's in a top isolation situation, he really can't get to his shot without a screen. He needs that there. So he's not going to get to an off the dribble shot to create separation for himself. He almost exclusively drives. So people will load up on that as well if he's going to be your primary. Um, so maybe not as big of a deal if you're still going to be relying on Tatum to do a lot of that type of stuff, and then you are comfortable with Brogdon playing off the ball and getting that type of driving kick action like I referenced. But to me, it still kind of feels like, let me be careful here because I don't want the Boston faithful to get mad at me. If you're Brad Stevens, you make this trade every single time. Like
Yeah.
there's no questioning to me that you trade for Malcolm Brogdon. But it still kind of feels to me that Brogdon doesn't necessarily solve their core issues, which is like Tatum's going to have to get better at drawing fouls around the basket. His playmaking, while it did make strides, is still going to have to get a little bit better, because I still think you're going to need him to create the initial advantage. And then, Jalen Brown's handles is also going to have to improve. This relieves some of that, but I don't think it completely fixes it.
Yeah, it's a release valve, and that's the point. Like, this is why I thought the playmaking need was overrated here, is because it's going to be Tatum at the end of the day, no matter what, with the ball in his hands, running the offense, whatever you want to call him, point guard, point forward, whatever those roles shake out to be. Tatum's going to have the ball in his hands more than anyone else throughout the course of a game. It almost felt like spacing was the bigger need for him when Grant Williams declined as the postseason went on and some of their shooting stagnated. You talk about Brogdon being an effective off-ball guy, and especially at times in his career, an elite catch and shoot guy. He brings multiple layers of offense. It seems like that really helped him at the spot. But I mean, like you said, the cost is obvious. You're going to make this deal 100 out of 100 times just to get a player who consolidates your roster a little bit, gives you another tool, gives you depth, gives you someone who can step into Smart's role if he's hurt, or spell Tatum for a game if he needs a night off. There's a million different reasons you would do this, but I just find that characterization that they needed a playmaking point guard, right? Just to toss the phrase around that's been used a million different ways, it felt like that was really a need. And Brad Stevens said that was a need after the season went on, some more playmaking. And I just wonder, when you look at him as a player, the ways in which he's gonna be able to relieve that and what that means for Marcus Smart, because I feel like that more than anything else could be the only downside of this, unless he gets hurt, it is them kind of butting heads a little bit over that spot, if you want to call it the point guard position, the starting role, whatever it is. These two guys who I think both take pride in that role, both want that role on a team, but there's really only one spot in the starting lineup or on the floor in crunch time. These guys probably could play together in crunch time, but who knows how that shakes out. And that's the only pause I have about this move, is just what it means for Marcus Smart, how he receives it, and where Brogdon kind of fits in, because it feels like you almost have to start Smart and continue to play him in that role to assure him that that is still his role here and he's not being demoted by this move.